Start. Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know or are new to the weekly seminars, my name is Siddiqui Perry. I'm the Academic Programs Coordinator with the School of Environment. First and foremost, I know it's the end of January and you're tired of hearing this, but Happy New Year. For those I haven't seen yet since the start of the new year, given everything that's going on, I hope that you've been taking care, staying safe. Welcome to the first session of the semester. Really appreciate you coming out. We're gonna keep having we have about 8 or 9 sessions this semester, so keep on the lookout for them and keep joining us, and really appreciate it. And if you have any questions, to any of you new in the group, I'll leave my email below and you can reach out. So today we have Mr. Miles Meyer, and he's a supervisor of supervisory fish and wildlife biologist in the comprehensive Everglades restoration program at the South Florida Ecological Services Field Office in Vero Beach, Florida. He manages a diverse team, including biologists, hydrologists. Well, I practice that word and I'm still gonna mess it up. Hydrologists. Did I get that right? The GIS staff who work across programs within the service. Miles has been with the service for over 26 years, and previous to that was with the U.S. Forest Service in South Dakota and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Jacksonville, Florida. He started his career as a student volunteer for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service while attending Jacksonville University, working on his BS degree in marine science and biology. He earned his MS in marine science with an emphasis in contaminants from the University of South Carolina in Columbia, South Carolina. Miles enjoys working with people and is the coordinator for social media outreach volunteer, intern, and diversity programs in his office. So let's go ahead and welcome Miles. He will direct you on how you'd like for you to participate and ask your questions. I ask at this time that you make sure that you're muted, aware of your surroundings, and let's give him our undivided attention. Welcome, Miles, and thank you for coming.
Sure, no problem. I appreciate getting the opportunity to talk with the students and faculty at Florida A&M. As was mentioned, I am in charge of our outreach and volunteer programs, as well as our diversity and outreach programs with our South Florida Ecological Services Office. So right now I currently manage a little over a dozen volunteers and working on various projects remotely. So if anyone is interested in learning more about our volunteer program or potential internships that we might have available, please contact me, offline, and we can have that discussion. And sure, Siddiqui will provide my email address to anyone who's interested. So what I'm going to talk about today is the South Florida Comprehensive Ecosystem Restoration Project, or the Everglades Restoration Project. And I am going to share my screen and let's see, get the right one. There we go. So hopefully you all can see my PowerPoint presentation. If you have any questions, you can either post them in the chat and we'll get to those afterwards, or you can, well, I think it's probably the best way of doing it because I can't tell if somebody raises their hand when I have my screen open doing the presentation. So, and we'll just go on with the slides and have a question and answer session after we're done here. As I said, this is going to be an overview of the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Program. I supervise a small team from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that works in the Southern Everglades, which is the water conservation areas south of Lake Okeechobee into Everglades National Park, Biscayne Bay, and Florida Bay. Our Northern Everglades restoration team handles the Everglades agricultural area, Lake Okeechobee and the Kissimmee River Basin, as well as the estuaries, Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie estuaries. So the key tenet of South Florida ecosystem restoration is hydrologic restoration. So basically, the way we will look at this is if we get the water right, the ecosystem will be right. So in South Florida, there's a lot of water control structures that are down there, and a lot of work has been done to tame the waters of the Everglades over the last century. And what we are trying to do in cooperation with all of our partners is to restore the hydrology back to these areas, to restore the habitat back to the way it should be. And we look at that in 4 components. We look at the quantity, the quality, the timing, and the distribution of the water. When we talk about quantity of water, we're talking about how much water flows to a certain area. Whether that's, hundreds of thousands of acre feet or, less. Whether that, that quality of the water, the nutrients that are in that water, how much phosphorus is in that, how much nitrogen is in that water. High nutrients can cause damage to the ecosystems in South Florida. They can encourage overgrowth of certain vegetation, including cattails, which is not necessarily native to the Everglades system. The timing of that water is also important. Does it come during the drought season? Does it come in huge amounts during the wet season? Are they holding the water back so that we have water all season long, all year long? And then the distribution. Where does that water get sent to? Does it get sent to tide? Does it get sent down canals and used for agricultural and urban purposes? Does it get put back into the natural environment? And if it does get put into the natural environment, is it put into the right locations? So I'll give you a little bit of an overview about the South Florida ecosystem and the history of what's been going on in South Florida. And then we'll talk a little bit about where we're pushing the ecosystem restoration to go. When we look at the South Florida ecosystem, you can see the area in sort of the brownish and green is the area we're talking about. So it's the Kissimmee River Basin from Orlando south, and then Lake Okeechobee, the drainage basin for Lake Okeechobee, and then the Everglades down into the Keys. And this covers about 18,000 square miles, which is twice the size of New Jersey. And there's about 8-9 million people in South Florida currently, and that population is continually increasing. And they're utilizing the limited resources that are available in that area. So the CNSF project, or the Central and Southern Florida Project, was authorized in 1948 to provide flood protection and fresh water to South Florida. What happened is, prior to this, in the 1930s, there were several major catastrophic hurricanes that came through, and they flooded Lake Okeechobee, and many of the towns around Lake Okeechobee were flooded. And there were dozens of people who were killed during these hurricanes. And so the government came in and said, we need to control Lake Okeechobee. We need to control the waters in the Everglades so that we don't have this problem. And so they constructed the Herbert Hoover Dike, which now encircles Lake Okeechobee, and they began building these canal structures. And so currently we have about 2,100 miles of canals, 2,000 miles of levees, and over 600 water control structures, along with 70 plus pump stations and hundreds and hundreds of culverts trying to direct the water into certain locations. This is an example of what one of the water control structures look like. This is a fairly average size structure. You can see in the canal, there's a little gate structure there. You can see there's a truck sitting next to it, give you a little comparison in size. And then that pump station there would probably have 4 to 5 pumps located within it, pumping water back into the Everglades or out of the Everglades, depending on where that's located. We have much larger pump stations than that in some parts of the Everglades, though. So as I mentioned, one of the major issues that the CNSF project was put in place was to control flooding in urban areas. And you can see here, this is the urban interface along the east coast of Florida. And then where the highway is located there is the levee that separates the natural area from the urban area. And then on the left-hand side is the natural habitat with a canal surrounding it and then the levee. You also see the power structures, the power cables that are there providing power from Florida Power and Light and the nuclear power plants and so on to the urban areas. And so this is where we have an issue of, urban encroachment on the natural environment right up to the levee. And then you have the natural environment, which has been impacted by the canal structure that surrounds it, and then smaller internal levees for flood protection. So historically, the water that went into Lake Okeechobee through the Kissimmee River overflowed the Lake Okeechobee, and you had this, what was this custard apple and cypress swamp that surrounded the lower banks of Lake Okeechobee. And then that water flowed into the sawgrass and then into the ridge and slough. You had a marl prairie surrounding it, and then you had Shark River Slough, and the water went into Florida Bay. But after the CNSF project was put in place, we ended up with a lot of compartmentalized areas. So you see the water conservation areas, or WCA 1, 2, and 3. These are all enclosed by levees that maintain these areas as water storage facilities. You see that the southern area below Lake Okeechobee is now the Everglades agricultural area. And so that is all agriculture now, sugar cane and other row crops. Lake Okeechobee has a levee that surrounds it, controlling the water within it. And there's only a couple outlets. You have the C-43 or the Caloosahatchee outlet, and then the C-44 or the St. Lucie outlet. Going down, you see all of this area here that used to be the eastern floodway or eastern part of the Everglades, and the coastal ridge that went up down the southern and eastern edge of the Everglades is now all urban. This is all Miami, West Palm, and so on, all connected urban systems there. So we no longer have that flood protection or that flood storage that we had previously in those areas. And it's become concrete and asphalt, so the water isn't stored very well there. And then you see the series of canals. And some of these canals direct water from Lake Okeechobee into the Everglades, and some of them direct them out into the estuaries. So the water doesn't flow the way it used to. So I'll show you a little bit of a flood diagram here. And this is how the water used to flow down the Kissimmee and then through Lake Okeechobee, and then in sheet flow pattern through the Everglades. But when all of the canals were built, all of that sheet flow disappeared, and the water flowed through the canals. And if it flowed out to the coast, now you have these point source freshwater distribution areas. And that fresh water damaged the coastal areas. We end up with loss of seagrass, loss of corals, things that different types of habitat that couldn't stand the freshwater input. And then you see a little bit of flow going into the Everglades. Well, in the future, when we manage all of this, we're going to be able to distribute that flow. It'll still come down the canals through the agricultural areas and through the urban areas, because we can't do anything with those areas currently. But the idea here is to then sheet flow that water back into the Everglades system. And we have to clean that water before it goes into the Everglades system, because it's going through agricultural areas all the way to the north through the Kissimmee Basin. And so there's a high amount of nutrients that flows in this water currently. And so we have what are called stormwater treatment areas, which are thousands of acres of man-made habitat that simulates the natural wetlands. So the task force, the Restoration Task Force, is our overarching governing body. And they talk, they're the ones that look at getting the water right, restoring and preserving and protecting the natural habitats and the species, and fostering the compatibility of the built and natural systems. So those are the goals that are presented in Everglades restoration. And you can see we've got a lot of different agencies that are involved. Department of Interior, Army Corps of Engineers is the federal partner for this. They're the ones that provide the majority of the funding and the design work. The state partner is the South Florida Water Management District. But you can see the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, the Florida DEP, Florida Department of Agriculture, as well as federal agencies, the National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, USGS, NOAA, EPA, NRCS, and USDA are all involved in these projects. And so we have what are called project delivery teams. And those teams are multi-agency, along with opportunities for public and nonprofit organizations to be involved in the decision-making. And those are the teams that develop the projects that are being implemented in Everglades restoration. So back in 2000, WRDA, or the Water Resources Development Act of 2000, was passed. And this is the plan that Congress approved. And it was a 30-year plan estimated at $7.8 billion at that point in time, 2 decades ago. And we developed what was called the Restudy, or the Yellow Book. And it's not actually just one book, it's probably a dozen or so volumes, several, close to 1,000 pages each volume of the plans that were being proposed for Everglades restoration. And I know you can't see the details in this slide, but this just gives you an idea of the components that are involved in Everglades restoration. The chart on the left lists all of the projects and all of the important dates, start dates, end dates, construction dates, and so on. And this is called the Integrated Delivery Schedule, or IDS. And you can look this up online. The Army Corps of Engineers Jacksonville District has it on their webpage. And you can see this in a lot more detail. On the right-hand side is the map of South Florida with all of the project locations identified on the map, so you can see where these are. And so every couple of years we update this IDS because not everything happens on schedule. The schedules are based on assumptions of federal and state funding and the availability of contractors to do the work. If the federal funding or the state funding is not sufficient for a certain year, projects get put on hold or delayed, and contracts may not be let. So things do slip on these schedules. So we have to keep this IDS up to date on a regular basis. So this is the most expensive environmental restoration project ever. Right now, it's estimated around $18 billion. Notice that's a little bit more than the $7.8 billion that was scheduled in 2000. But again, we are 20 years out from that point in time. Costs have gone up a little bit since then. It is a 50-50 cost share between the federal and state governments for the construction, as well as operation and maintenance. So there are agreements, and the federal and state governments, both the Army Corps of Engineers and the state water management district, both have to agree on the funding for these activities up front. So there's a lot of information on this, but this is just showing you some of the details that are involved in an individual project. So this is the Everglades agricultural area up here in the upper corner of this map. And you can see the water conservation areas as you go down. You can see different structures that are being placed in here. So the red line is storage and treatment. So we have stormwater treatment areas that are placed above this area here. You see the A1, A2. These are what are called flow equalization basins. These are shallow lakes, 6 feet deep. Well, they up to 6 feet deep. Usually they're about 2 to 3 feet in depth. The black areas down here are stormwater treatment areas. These are the wetlands that are created to treat the water that's coming in. Then it flows down the boundaries and then flows into structures that are located here. The S8 structure is a pump that pumps it into the Miami Canal. Then you see we have the L67 canal, and this is going to be backfilled. So you can see the little X's here are the backfilling of the canal. This is another levee. These are new outlets that let water flow through. And this is just one project. This is the CERP project. This is the Central Everglades Planning Project that this entails. So you can sort of imagine the detail that has to be put in place to design this one single project here. And there's 67 projects in total. So as we design all of these restoration projects, we have to look at a lot of things that might be affected. And so I'm going to go through some of the stuff that the Fish and Wildlife Service is looking at, which are our threatened and endangered species. So the Fish and Wildlife Service handles the Endangered Species Act portion of these projects. And so this is the Cape Sable Seaside Sparrow. It's a sparrow, small brown bird. It is a ground nesting bird. And so you can see these little guys here. I'll give you an idea of the nests. These nest in what are called the marl prairies. And so these are large grasslands in the Everglades. These are wetlands areas that are grassed over, so they're dry part of the year. There's a nest here. They build these nests inside of these clumps of grass. Okay, the nests have about three to four eggs per nest, and two youngs fledge on average per nest. What we try to do is keep the area dry enough so that they can have 2 nests every year. That means that they can have up to 4 fledglings usually between March and July. Okay. Notice the nests here are about 6.5 inches above ground level. So if the water level goes too high, the nests will go underwater and drown. So they will not be successful in those areas. And then you can see under the grass area, there's this white material, and this is periphyton. This is a type of something like an algae that grows on the surface of the water. So when the water then goes below ground surface, the periphyton covers the ground surface in these areas. These birds, when they come out of the nests, they tend to stay on the ground. They don't fly very much. And so the young will run in between these clumps of grass and use the clumps of grass for hiding. So as I mentioned, these birds are fairly sedentary. They don't fly very far. They occupy the marl prairie habitat, and they have adults survive about 66% every year. So about 1/3 of the adults die every year through predation or other methods. And juveniles have about a 34% survival rate. They tend to have a short life expectancy of about 2 to 3 years, but we have seen them longer than that, 4 and 5 years old. And they require a hydro period of 90 to 210 days. That means the area needs to be wet 90 to 210 days to maintain the marl prairie habitat, the grasslands that are there. If it gets too dry for too long, trees will start to grow in those areas. And these sparrows do not like habitat where trees are located, because birds of prey can then sit in those trees and then pick them off as they run between the grass. If it gets too wet, that area turns into sawgrass. And sawgrass is not conducive to nesting. It's also too wet for the nests because the nests are only 6.5 inches above ground surface. So there's a lot of things that we have to look at as far as hydrology, as far as the amount of water that goes into an area where the Cape Sable seaside sparrows live. It also takes about 40 to 45 days for them to go from building their nest to hatching the eggs. So that nesting period, it has to stay dry that entire nesting period. The water cannot go to the nest level during that period. And so we try to keep it dry for up to 90 days during a nesting season so we can possibly get 2 nests out. And when the water does come up too high, they will abandon those nests and they'll have to start over when the water goes back down. So here's a map showing where the sparrows are located. All of these orange areas with letters are where the sparrows are located. So we do get a little bit of cross movement between the populations that are east of the slough, but the population on the west side of the slough does not cross over the slough very frequently. I think we've had 2 birds in the last 8 years cross the slough between the one that's marked A and the ones that are marked E and B. So they don't cross over very much in those areas. This is a population diagram of the Cape Sable seaside sparrow. So you can see back here in 1981 and 1992, we had over 6,000 sparrows. And then in 92 to 93, the population dropped below 3,000. So we had a 50% decline in the number of sparrows, Cape Sable seaside sparrows in this habitat. And then it's been fluctuating in this 3,000 number range. And in each of these lines below it are the numbers that are located in each of the subpopulations. So you see some of these subpopulations have very few birds. Some have the range of maybe about 1,000. Subpopulation B here is right around 2,000 birds in that grouping. Okay, and what happened here for this large drop to occur was this is about the same time as Hurricane Andrew when it came through. And so we had the Hurricane Andrew came through. A lot of the habitat was destroyed by the hurricane, And then the habitat remained flooded for 2 years. And so the birds were not able to reproduce very successfully in that period of time. The Everglades snail kite is another species that we deal with. It's another listed species. And the interesting thing about this snail kite only eats snails. It only eats apple snails. And so it's very selective in its diet. And now we have, if you go to a pet store, you can buy those great big huge snails that they sell. And those are apple snails also, but those are invasive apple snails. And so what's happened is, as people have gotten those in their aquariums, they've released them into the wild, into the canals and things of that sort. And they have taken over the habitat. And so they've displaced the native apple snails. The snail kites had to actually evolve to eat those non-native snails. They actually had to increase their beak length over a period of a couple years, of a couple decades. And now their beak length is substantially longer than it was 20 or 30 years ago. And that allows them to eat these apple snails. So we're actually watching evolution in process because of that. So you can see this is where the snail kite is located. It's located in Central and South Florida, also in Cuba, Central America, and Northern South America. And occasionally you do find them individuals in different locations. We've had a couple in Arkansas recently. And in the last couple of years, we actually had a sighting in the Balkan oil fields up north. So in Canada and in South Dakota, which is odd. We don't know why they were up there. We have a very substantial monitoring program. University of Miami, University of Florida participate in this monitoring program. They go out every 2 months, during the breeding season, every 3 weeks to do surveys. And you can see that they band the birds in the nests. So they'll take the birds out of the nest and band them so that we have them marked. They also add GPS trackers to them, cell tower trackers or UHF trackers to them so that we can track the birds and their location. And you can see here in about from 96 to 98, we started to see a decline in the population. And it went from about 3,000 birds to a little over 1,500 birds in the mid 2000s. And then it dropped below 1,000 birds in around 2008 to 2012. And we've been gradually going back up on an increase now. And last year we had a drop. We're about 2,200, 2,300 snail kites currently. But the last 2 years, we've had very little breeding going on because of high water conditions during their nesting season. So they have not been able to feed on the snails because the water's been too deep and the snails have not been able to reproduce. And the snails can stay below water level and avoid being consumed by the snail kites. So you probably all know about manatees. It's another species that we deal with quite a bit in Everglades restoration, mainly because they can get up the canals in many of these areas. And with all of these structures that are being constructed on the canals, sometimes the manatees will sit at the structures, and when a structure opens, they will go in the structure and then move further up the canals. And then if a canal is closed, then they're stuck up there and not able to get back down into warmer water. So they do have to perform manatee rescues in many cases. Also, because we're changing the flow of the water from point source to sheet flow, the point source areas are no longer as available as they were in the past. And so manatees have to adapt to new locations. Hard to see this a little bit, but the manatee population has gone from about 1,200 in 1991 to a little over 600. I think it's about 6,300 at the last survey that was published in 2018. So we've got a constant increase in manatees, which is good. That means that manatees are successfully breeding in these areas. One of the projects that we have is associated with Picayune Strand, and Picayune Strand was a subdivision, 50,000 acre subdivision in South Florida. It was called Golden Gates Estates, Southern Golden Gates Estates. And so for that subdivision, they built all the roads and they started to build houses within that And then people started realizing that all of that land was actually wetlands. This was that great big, you know, everybody hears, I got some great land to sell you in Florida. It happens to be all wetlands, you know, sort of thing. And this was what they were doing. They were selling to all people all over the world. They were selling to a lot of people in South America who never, you know, they would only come up during the dry season, and they would show the land and show them how beautiful the land was and how dry it was. But then as soon as dry season was over, there'd be 2 feet of water on the land. And so they wouldn't be able to construct their homes. But all of the houses and the drainage canals, or all of the roads and the drainage canals, were constructed in these areas. So what happened then, the development went bankrupt. The government has bought all of that land now, and they're preserving it. They're restoring that land back into Everglades conditions. So it's part of the Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge and a couple other state conservation areas that are down there. This area up in the top of this photograph is Port of the Islands. It's a little subdivision in the middle of the Everglades, and you can see this canal that runs right through it. And that canal allows the people that live here to go out into Florida Bay. Well, what we're doing now is we're changing the way the water flows. The water no longer flows directly into this canal, which was a drainage canal. It now flows across the landscape here. So that meant that this area, the water temperature is going to change, and it potentially will be getting cooler than it had in the past. And so manatees that would travel up and down this canal could get entrapped in here and not be able to withstand the cooler water temperatures. So we designed this structure here, this little wavy structure here, as a manatee refugia. So these little pooled areas up here are actually dug below ground, or below the groundwater surface, so that the water stays at constant temperature. And the manatees can then travel up into this and sit in these pools and you know, take that warmer water when we have a cold front come through. And the manatees have been utilizing this area over the past several years. Another thing that's come up is the invasive species, and you've probably all heard about the pythons in Florida. And so invasive species are a major issue that we have to deal with. When I worked for the Army Corps of Engineers, I was with the invasive species management program there, and our program dealt with vegetation. So things like Australian pine, melaleuca, Brazilian pepper, water hyacinths, water lettuce, those sort of species that, those plant species that are invasive in the Everglades system. But now we have a lot of animal species, the pythons, various different species of pythons that are there now. Lizards such as the Argentine or black and white tegu, which feed on the eggs of alligators and ground nesting birds. The pythons, we've had over 90% decrease in small mammals in the Everglades, mostly due to pythons consuming them. So they will eat anything.
Miles, I'm sorry. I am so sorry. I don't know if it's my glasses. What is that exactly?
So this is a python. This is, yes.
It looks like it has a, I am so sorry. I'm looking at this thing. I had to stop. It looks like it looks like it has an alligator mouth.
Yeah, so the head is over on the end of the boat.
Oh, okay.
You see and then what he's holding is the tail. So
Yeah.
it's probably about a 14 or 15 foot python that they had captured out there. And so these guys will eat alligators, they will eat deer, and smaller ones will eat rabbits and raccoons and any other thing that they can get. So yeah, they're very detrimental to the habitat out there. There's hundreds of thousands of these now. They got loose through the pet trade, basically.
Yeah, I heard that when I was a kid. Okay, I am so sorry.
Yeah.
I'm looking at this thing. It looks like it's my crazy here. It looks like it was like a long mouth there at the end of the boat, and then it was clear like I passed on the rest of it. But my apologies. It was just it was throwing me off.
No problem. No problem. It's I can see what I'm looking at because I know what I'm looking at here. And you may have seen the pictures a few years ago of the python that exploded after it ate an alligator. because alligators, they're hard to kill. And so there's either two things that happen: either as the alligator decomposed, it expanded and blew up the python, or the alligator was still alive after it got consumed and it clawed its way out and then died. We don't know which direction that happened, but so they will eat very large prey. And when we look at the invasive species, this is we deal with what's called rapid rapid assessment and rapid intervention sort of process. And so we hope to get in this area of prevention, educating people. You see that there are exotic pet amnesty days in South Florida. If you have an exotic pet, you can hand them in on these amnesty days, and they will just be taken by the state and put into care there, or sometimes destroyed depending on the species. But we want to get to them before they can become a problem. Then if they start getting into the wild, we want to get in early and eradicate them before they become breeding populations. So, maybe there's only a dozen of them in this area. We can go in and try to trap them and eradicate them before they get too bad. But if they start to reproduce, then we have to look at containment. How do we keep them in that area and not spread? But a lot of the stuff that we deal with now is just trying to deal with, there's too many, because we don't get the funding down here to deal with the problem up here. So we are dealing with, trying to get rid of the problem after it's become a problem. Down here, the economic return is 1 on 100. So for every dollar we spend, we save $100 down here. Up here, for every dollar we spend, we save $1. It's not very productive. So that's just a few things with the species that we deal with in the habitats, but we also have to look at the socioeconomic issues that are in the Everglades. How does the work that we're doing down there affect recreation, fishing, hunting, boating, hiking, those sort of things? Does the moving the water from a canal into the wetlands, does that harm bass fisheries? Because the bass fisheries are utilizing those canals. But maybe by doing that, we then increase the snook fishery in Florida Bay. So what's the trade-off there? We have to limit boating and hiking in some areas, or access to some areas, because water levels get too deep. So we have to be aware of that. We also have to be aware of tribal cultures. They utilize tree islands for different ceremonial purposes and for farming purposes. They have residential areas within the Everglades. We have to know where those residential areas are so that we can avoid flooding them or avoid damage to those areas. We have to look at flood control. There's an area in the Everglades called 8.5 square mile area, which is susceptible to flooding if water levels get too high in the Everglades itself. So we have to manage for that. We have to look at agricultural interests. A lot of the area in South Dade County is agricultural. A lot of row crops grow down there. This is where people get, a lot of their food. So, we don't want to damage those areas. And then we also have to look at sea level rise. What is the effect of sea level rise on all of this? Can the restoration we're doing help make those areas more resilient so that they are less susceptible to sea level rise? Is sea level rise causing saltwater intrusion into the well fields for Miami and other urban areas? Is it also causing, saltwater intrusion up the canals and into some of these wetland areas? We have an area in the Southern Everglades called the White Zone, which is where, as sea level rises, the mangroves continually move further inland. And so we have an area, when you look at satellite imagery, you can see this white area of mangrove movement over time. And so those are all the things that we have to look at when we address Everglades restoration. So I'm going to open it up to any questions. It's 5 till noon now. So I'll let you guys have any questions that you may have, and I will stop sharing my screen as soon as there we go. Okay. So I see in the questions, I see the first one is, what exactly is Florida Everglades Restoration Project? I hope that some of the questions that I had there were answered. And there was a question about providing the PowerPoint. I did send Siddiqui a PDF of the PowerPoint. So that is there. And so you can get access to that. And he is recording this, so that will be available also. And another question is, since the invasive species is a big problem, why isn't there more focus on the people that release the pets into the wild? So we have a federal regulation called the Lacey Act, which prohibits the interstate transport of species, of certain species. Notice it's interstate transport. It means moving it from Florida to Georgia, or from, out of Florida. It's not within the state. So that's, the federal law cannot manage what happens within a state boundaries. We can only manage what happens across state boundaries. So the state, though, can manage what happens inside the state. And so, they have licensing requirements. For some of these species, you are required to pit tag your individual. You are required to get an annual license to possess some of these species. And if one of those individuals that was pit tagged and, you had a permit for it, gets found in the wild, you are fined for that, for that individual being released into the wild. But there's a lot of other species, such as the fish. There's no way of really controlling somebody from dumping their aquarium into the canal behind their house. And so, we have Mayan cichlids, we have peacock bass, we have lionfish, we have Plecostomus, or the armored catfish, that, are all over in South Florida, along with many other species of invasive fish that are all over in South Florida. So those, it's hard to control them. We try to do it by education, a lot of outreach that goes on in those areas. And that's where we get the biggest bang for the buck, is trying to educate people to not release their pets into the wild. Let's see. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we're a federal agency. We did put in, this is a question about why doesn't our department lobby for new laws? We did a rewrite of the Lacey Act a couple of years ago, just recently. And we were sued by the pet industry for impacting their economic viability by eliminating the, or by regulating the transport of species that are actively farmed here in Florida. Many of these reptile species, there are places in South Florida that raise these for trade within the United States. And, so they may raise these pythons that you can buy over at Pet Supermarket, or the lizards that you buy over there. And then they ship them to all over the US for the pet industry. And we were sued because of the economic impact that would have on their industry, and we lost that case. So we had to go back to a previous version of the Lacey Act. We're working on revising the Lacey Act now to address those loopholes and try to make it more effective. And hopefully that'll work with the next rewrite. And I see Don Axelrod has his hand up. He has a question.
Hey, Miles, thank you so much for the presentation. Quite interesting. I suppose, to be blunt about it, I've been critical of the federal government for being far more concerned about water quantity than water quality, a topic I spent about 25 years on. Any thoughts on your part? I mean, what is your comprehension of what Everglades water quality problems are, and what should be done about it?
Yeah, so I mean, we do have a task force that deals with the water quality issue that incorporate, that has federal agency involvement in it. And we are involved in water quality through a number of different ways. But the main issue we have is that Everglades ecosystem restoration assumes that the state already regulates water quality. And so we assume that water quality criteria are already met the federal government, the Army Corps of Engineers, is not allowed to regulate water quality in the projects that they develop. They can look at water quality issues beyond the state legal mandate if it is directly related to ecosystem restoration. So all of the STAs that are being constructed are to get the water quality down to the state regulation levels. And so those all have to be done by the state agencies. And then the federal government assumes that they are meeting their quality regulations, and therefore ecosystem restoration does not incorporate that water quality into its components. That's
if I could comment.
Yeah.
If I could comment, and none of this is your fault, but
No.
the state has via legal means avoided dealing with water quality issues. Now we know about phosphorus. There's a lot in place, a lot of expenditure to deal with that, and it's been largely successful. But if you look at mercury, all the state has done is a TMDL, a total maximum daily load.
Mhm.
And they say because they've done it, that they've met their water quality obligation. But the food chain in the Glades is still toxic to fish-eating birds, including great egret, white ibis, eagles, and so we're not successful there. And then we got this other one, which the state has avoided dealing with because they haven't set a water quality criterion for sulfide in waters of Everglades. And as we know, we've got a lot of sulfur coming in from agricultural areas. And I will tell you that undissociated hydrogen sulfide in Everglades surface waters is higher than is acceptable for larval fish and invertebrates. And, you know, me having worked on this for a while, I do get frustrated because agencies with regulatory powers find ways around dealing with this. But again, not your fault, but I thought you should hear it.
Yeah, with the sulfides, you know, the sulfides do increase the ability for mercury to be, released into the ecosystem. So yeah, when the federal agencies look at this, we look at, are we introducing a new source of those pollutions into a new area? You know, is this water containing mercury? We're moving it now to this area over here, and now we're going to be putting more mercury into a new area. And so that's the way that we can look at it. But again, yeah, as you mentioned, it's all in federal regulations that, you know, we do not deal. And when I say we, I'm talking about all of federal agencies combined. The Army Corps of Engineers in their planning cannot directly look at water quality as a goal in ecosystem restoration. We just have to try to make sure that the water we're moving meets the standards that are necessary.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
All right, everyone, if there's no further questions, again, Miles, I can't thank you enough. This was great. I've already gotten private messages regarding that PDF, and so I'll send it out shortly to everyone. And thank y'all for coming. It's really appreciated. Be on the lookout for our other sessions as well. Okay, it looks like a question just popped up.
Just a comment. That's all. It's just a comment, no question.
Okay, you wanna say it, Dr. Hightower?
No, that's just I was just saying something to Mr. Axelrod. We were talking about this question about water quality. But there's also, in my opinion, another issue for Florida, and that's the soon-to-be scarcity of fresh water in the state of Florida, which Miles didn't talk about at all. But there's I know Florida is I think 8th. I'm sorry, not Florida, but Miami is the 8th. What is it? Most scarce. In other words, there are these worldwide organizations that rank places around the world that are in danger of running out of fresh water. And a couple of years ago, I know we were, or Miami or the South Florida area was like 8th in the world, behind some major cities, and that's probably outside of Mr. Miles's wheelhouse. But there are additional freshwater concerns for Florida, and
Right.
Lake Okeechobee and the Everglades play a key role. That's all I wanted to
Yeah,
share.
and we're building very large, well, the Everglades restoration is building very large above ground reservoirs. We're talking 30,000 acres, 130,000 acre feet of storage in some of these above ground reservoirs. And, so that we can distribute the water in a better timing, as opposed to flushing all of the water out during the wet season. We want to retain some of that water so that we can utilize it during the dry season and keep some areas hydrated. But also, as you were talking about with Miami, they get all of their water from the Biscayne Aquifer system. And we end up, as they draw more water out of that, it pulls the salt water further inland. And we do see it in the canals that near the well fields, that you can see water, salt water being pulled further up into those areas. And we also see it in the aquifer also with saltwater intrusion. So yeah, definitely some other problems. Fish and Wildlife Service is not that involved in those issues, but they are things that are discussed very much in our project delivery teams, or our PDTs. And also I put my email address in there and in the chat. And as I mentioned at the beginning, if there's any students that are interested in volunteering or potentially doing a semester internship or something of that sort, you can contact me, and we may have some opportunities to get you some experience working on some of the projects that we deal with.
Thanks.
And to all our SOE students, Miles and his team have been forwarding a lot of opportunities, and I've been passing along, so check those emails, okay? Again, Miles, thank you so much.
Sure.
If you can hang on,
Yep.
and you and I will talk privately briefly. Just thank you again.